question as far as the approach when it comes to working with clients is how do you apply that technique we're talking about as far as like me noticing things in myself and like those resistances in myself, acknowledging those like boundaries. How did you come to do that with clients? The stretching metaphor is good. I think that makes sense. Even talking about like defenses against like overstretching, like there's working with someone like physically, that makes sense. But then these other realms that you're working in.
Kind of what led me there?
Yeah. So like, I think we start there. Yeah. Like what led you there to being able to turn that inward process outward?
I hate to say it, but it probably started sitting at the Rolf Institute, passing that damn crystal around the circle.
I had a feeling.
But at the Rolf Institute, in working, in being taught how to work with fascia, there's a couple of key moments that I remember, and of course, I'm sure there were many others that I don't remember right now. But like I remember one time I was standing there. The institute near the end of your training, they do a student clinic thing where clients come in to be Rolfed, and so I'm working on this person for the first time, and I'm down on their shin doing a Rolfing technique, and one of the instructors said, okay, I was doing a good job in what I was doing, but she said, expand your focus, like you're just focusing on the shin, like expand your focus all the way up to the hip. And I remember, at the time, cognitively, I didn't understand quite what, but I did it, and it was like, oh, whoa, that's different. I could just feel it that it was, this idea of expanded scope and the idea of what they would call end feeling, where we do these different exercises. For example, there's kind of a fun exercise, like if you take a stack of, I think we were just using these little cutoff 2x4s at the time, and say you just lay even just 3 of them. If you stack 3 of them, and then you just put your hand on the top one, and it's like, well, if you put a certain kind of pressure, you can slide the top one over the bottom 2. But if you put a little different pressure, you can start to get the top 2 to slide over the bottom one. And or if you do a different type of pressure, you can get all 3 of them to slide over the surface they're sitting on. And so that kind of layered approach, the idea of end feeling, where it's like if you take a person's foot and pull on it and then watch what goes on in their neck, and then you go over to some other person and you pull on their foot and watch what goes on up in their neck, and you start to get this end feeling experience where it's like, oh wow, there's a lot of variation and difference. And so I think my brain started playing with that stuff, at that point, meaning while at the Rolf Institute and then in my practice. And of course, being an athlete all my life and obsessing about my golf swing or my running gait or this or that, and so my mind was always thinking about these things and playing with these things. And then just doing it full time as a practice, sitting there, paying attention to a client laying on the table and noticing that it just came on more and more that what I'm doing with my attention is more important than what I'm doing with my hands, for example. And of course, it eventually shifted to where, and this coincided, I don't think coincidentally, with my waking up to seeing subtle energy, as I started noticing, even when my hands aren't even touching them, what I'm doing with my attention is affecting them. So then tracking that for hours and hours and hours and hours, you start noticing, there's all this complexity that starts to open out, and all this these layers and this richness. As that happened, just like I've said before, like with the music analogy, it's like initially I'm like, God, I'm starting to notice these like patterns, and then you find some book that explains the pattern, and it's like listening to music and noticing some kind of pattern, and then you find out like, oh, that's called a harmony, or that's called a melody, or yeah, that's called a beat, or you're noticing a thing that's called a key change. It's like, oh, all this stuff is already mapped out. And of course I'm like, well, how come no one ever gave me that frickin' map? Why have I floundered around without a map in these territories. And then it became obvious that, oh, okay, there are some maps, but they haven't been translated to contemporary terms very well. You know, it's like in Sufism, there's a bunch of maps that have to do with essence points, for example, but Almas translated a bunch of that stuff into Western vernacular that made it a hell of a lot easier to read and understand. I started reading all these different things and trying to understand these maps, and then in a similar way to Ken Wilber, tried to figure out how do I bring them all together into some kind of a theory of everything idea, and but at least theory of body work, mental work, imaginal work, subtle work. I guess the answer to your question is it came on through a series of insights and practices, and then finding theories and maps and books where it was like, oh my God, this is a map of the thing that I'm noticing, mm-hmm. you know, and then incorporating that language into it. And then it builds on itself, of course, because then you start to see the terrain via a certain map, and then it starts to evolve.
More pieces fall into place.
Right.
It's kind of a how do you get to Carnegie Hall aspect to it as well.
And you end up as just a lunatic map maker eventually, which is what I became. Just obsessively trying to create a better, more complete map, more accurate map.
A kooky cartographer.
Which is part of my thing with like getting picky about words and stuff. Because it feels like a map coordinate. And it's like, you can't use the wrong coordinate. Everything gets fucked up if
you... You won't get where I'm trying to send you.
Exactly.
We've touched on the steps in the approach before in the context of awakening and then healing.
We did it more, we went through the different types of work.
Right.
Which is a little different thing than these four things.
Totally. So in the context of healing, you're talking though about witnessing, holding, and mirroring. Is there more you want to say about, we kind of like sidetracked when you got to mirroring to go back to holding, but in the context of healing, kind of getting back to the structure of the site.
Our plan to do like one episode and go through this whole thing.
Died.
Yeah.
Died.
Yeah.
Well, it's kind of like how do you separate the approach from all of these things, right? Like this, it's what do you think came first for you in outlining it, right? Was it conscious witnessing, holding, containment, mirroring, contact, or was it, you know, awakening, healing, development, performance?
Well, certainly in my personal life, it all started with performance. I mean, that was my goal, was to try to run better. And then it became to be able to run at all.
Because you never really accepted the way you ran to begin with.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, unless I was world champion, I wasn't going to accept it. So it went in that direction. As I've said, I went to the Rolf Institute. I had no thoughts about personal growth or you know, even healing, let alone awakening. It was like, how, you know, what do I do differently, right? Like fix my body, which I guess you could say is healing, but I didn't even think of it in a healing aspect. It was more like make it just you know, in the same way that I had a very mechanical idea about it. So it's like, you know, you don't bring your car to the shop to get it healed. You bring it to get it fixed, right? And I was going to the Rolf Institute to get my body fixed and to learn how to fix bodies, or to learn how to fix my own body. And of course, that was part of the sitting around holding the crystal thing. Is it you know, it was this healing approach rather than this fix it approach. And not that Rolfing doesn't have a very mechanical aspect to it, but they were presenting the idea that you can't just lengthen out tissue without the person's psyche being involved. There's a mental emotional component, for example, that is in there and is intricately involved in what the tissue's doing. And like I've said, I fought that all through Rolfing school and for the first few years after. But then it started to shift to where, okay, the mental emotional aspect, the idea of, I became aware of character structure defenses a la Wilhelm Reich, became aware of the connection between mental emotional character defense structures and subtle energy, which is what Reich talks about. And, he called it orgone, and fascial tissue and tensegral structure. So there was that progression. The actual methodology of the dimension approach, that came on much, much later. I started working in 94, and it wasn't until probably, I don't know, sometime between 2005, 2010 that it really started to kind of come into a clear system in my mind. And I'm sure that had something to do with me doing a lot of reading in psychology in those years that I got my graduate degree, and started really making the connection between some of these psychological ideas around mirroring and around holding, around transference, around ego structures, around object relating. It was like coming from the subtle energy background and the physical background. So then to learn these psychological concepts, it's like they weren't just concepts to me. I had the actual sort of, existing mapping of the energetics. And so when I applied it to that, it was like, oh my God, they're talking about this.
Right. I think that's a really good point. Something I've always kind of thought about the way you approach it, that you had the experience for the theory you were learning.
Yeah.
Like there's state experiences undergirding all of these theoretical concepts, that the people who developed them had, that they couldn't maybe express in the way. This is just my feeling about it, that there are these state experiences you're having that kind of match the concept of holding, or the concept of mirroring, or the concept of energy work. That really that drive the efficacy of the work that you do. But I've always felt that these are experiences that the people who had these ideas had too. Does that make sense?
It does. It does. And I think that's the general progression it's like initially people have the experience, and then kind of the next phase is it can be expressed artistically. So for example, as poetry, and then only after there's been the experiential, and then only after there's been the poetic expression, then perhaps it can be translated into prose. There's that kind of that general progression. And that certainly was the case for me, where, I had these experiences and didn't know how to formulate them into my head and as these discrete concepts, but then via art, via different, poetry was a huge thing for me. I still do tons of stream of consciousness poetry. And then I'm still in the process of, like I said, obsessively trying to put it into rational, linear,
trying to translate it,
verbiage. And yeah.
that resonates with me. Just this energy of it, this energy of these experiences, of these state experiences, is so non-rational, but vibrant and helpful and informative, but difficult to translate.
The same exact point you were just making, that listening to this podcast or reading any of the things I've written, if you haven't had the experience prior, these concepts don't make much sense.
Yeah.
It's really for the people that have already had the experience, that then they can, like you said, apply the experience to this stuff, and then feel like, oh, that helps me organize some of the experiences I've had. But without the pre-existing experience, it's just kind of nonsensical.
Hopefully not totally nonsensical. We'll see. No, I know there's an element to that, but it could be a real downer thought if you think about it. It's all gibberish. It's all gibberish. I think that's why I appreciated the chakra exercises that we did is that hopefully just because I really think it is just noticing a state change is so significant, because it's just like a moment in time capturing what is happening all the time. So just noticing that, like, if noticing a shift in yourself is an awakening of sorts, that noticing that, like, you were one way a second ago and you're a different way now, it means that there is something that sees both of those things that's outside of those states.
Right.
So, but if you haven't had the experience, you haven't had the experience.
Yeah. There's a big percentage of the population that if they just saw you say that, they'd switch to some different podcast. Be like, I don't know what this fruitcake's talking about. But
I haven't seen a fruitcake in decades. Do people still eat fruitcake?
I don't know.
Or is it just a pejorative now? Like, there's no more physical fruitcakes left.
They're extinct. Yeah, they went extinct. So the shift to healing, like if you say, well, how is awakening different from healing? Which obviously it's tough to try. I'm trying to on here, but it's tough to try to do some kind of clear distinction, right? Because they all go together to varying degrees. But as I put it there, awakening is about realization. Healing's about reconnection, if we say that, right? And it's like, okay, well, what does that mean? Well, what I'm saying, and of course, I'm putting these like in the context of the dimension approach, right? Healing on an ego level is about repair of damage to ego structures. And by ego structures, I mean physical structures, mental structures, emotional structures, subtle energetic structures. And so the idea that we can incur wounds, we can have damage happen via injuries, traumas, etc., and that those injuries and wounds, an aspect of the damage that happens is that there's disorganization to the structures. In the same way that if you break your leg, there's some disorganization to the structure of that bone, and there's disorganization to fascial tissue, and etc. So healing involves a reorganization. Just like if you cut yourself, it's like, all right, there's damage, and now your body goes to work at trying to reorganize and bring it back towards the state that it was in prior to the damage. So there's repair that's happening. And then what I'm saying, as far as, well, how does consciousness and the dimension approach come into it? And it's that healing, and this part's super important, trauma, which is mainly where the dimension approach is required. If there hasn't been trauma, you don't really need the dimension approach. I could say a lot more about that, but what I'm saying is that when there's trauma, there's splitting. And when there's splitting, what has split is someone's connection to a conscious structure.
I think you've talked about that before, and I think it's an important point, because it's kind of, again, one of the cruxes of the dimension approach we've tried to share, is that this, and it's great that you bring in the physical analogy for it of breaking a bone, right? That there's physical structure that's disorganized. What also happens is there's compensatory structures that take its place in the meantime. And so that's where kind of these stacks of compensations that lead away from the original problem come into play. So you're talking about like the knee versus the ankle. You could break a bone, that gets repaired. 10 years later, your shoulder is out of whack, and they come for the shoulder, right? So that these, just like we talk about with the psyche and deprogramming, there's destructuring before restructuring. I just think that these analogies that you're using, the words you're using, tie into things we've talked about as far as this trauma causes both a split and restructuring,
right?
Compensatory restructuring. And so that those are the things that where the dimension approach comes in, like you're saying.
But the idea of psychic structure, physical structures are more obvious to talk about, but this is I'm going off on a tangent, so don't let me go too far.
I haven't been great at that today.
This idea of structure in the psyche is huge. The thing I'm always getting on my soapbox about with psychotherapists is that the idea of structure has been, people have gotten away from it. And again, it's this idea that there's just conscious choice to kind of think and be and do and feel, whoever you decide via your mind. And I just think it's inaccurate. The truth is you're extremely influenced by, motivated by, inhibited by structures in your psyche and or lack thereof. And so structural theory in psychology is a thing. Psychotherapists need to read about it because there's not even an understanding. Most therapists I talk to, they don't even, when I talk about structure or structural theory, they're just kind of like, I haven't heard of that. In the same way that chiropractors and orthopedics, when I talk about tensegrity, they're like, I had never heard that word before. It's astounding to me. I feel so, I don't even know what word. Obviously angry and frustrated.
Angry is
yes. But it's like past that, it's just like, it's so exasperated. It makes me crazy.
Yeah. I think, every day is a line of people walking in the door who have been told other things by other people. So, you get a lot of, the same reason to be upset every day.
Yeah.
So there's, I feel like in your tone, like there's years of frustration there.
There is. Yeah.
But like you're saying, I think that's what's really cool about the dimension approach as you've laid it out is that this process is the same because the ways in which these structures are affected is the same. If it's a physical or a psychic structure, the method is the same.
Yes.
Because the initial problem is the same. It's a trauma.
That's right.
That's caused a split or a destructuring. Or So that's what is like simple about it.
I can't tell you how good it feels to have another human being articulate that in a way that it makes me think like someone actually like gets it.
Well, I've been talking to you for a year about it, so let me. I'm kidding. No, I think that's been the value of talking through it though is that what are the highlights, right?
Yeah.
And the highlights are, here are the goals, here's the method, here is the underlying problem that is why the method exists. And then you spell out on the site that underlying problem looks different in different areas or different parts of the body or parts of the psychic field or parts of psyche. But trauma is what necessitates bringing, witnessing, holding, containing, mirroring, and contact to these things that have been, to these locations of trauma, to these dimensions of trauma. What's tough and what is so, I think, infuriating for you is that there is so much of the world that is just maintaining the compensatory structures. And those could be physical, fusing bones together. Those could be mental, put a smile on your face. Those could be the first thing for subtle, I think, is just repression, but lock it down, shut that part of yourself off. It's not helpful, useful, doesn't know anything, doesn't have a way to interact with the world. Just keep being who you think you are, and we'll help you, limp that across the finish line of death and call it good. And I think that's hopeless in so many ways. And I think people feel that, like going to the doctor, like that's what it feels like in some ways, when it doesn't feel like it's doing anything to help you grow or help you get better. It's so much of the medical field is just about, well, that part of you sucks now and you just got to move on. And like, obviously, like things happen, like there are physical injuries that happen that, like, you lose an arm, you're not going to grow an arm back.
Yeah.
But you lose an arm and you cut off that part of your life forever, it's going to affect the rest of you for the rest of your life.
Yeah.
So I think that's the the value of what you're doing. And that's why we're trying to describe it. And I think we end up going down rabbit holes for hours on end because that's fun. And but like when we try to talk about the approach, like the approach is bringing a radically different paradigm and a methodology that is as practical as it is fruitcakey, you know?
Right, right.
If you want to learn more about the Dimension Approach, please visit dimensionapproach.com.